Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Christophe Courchain. I'm the Faculty Director of the Environmental Law Center and Associate Dean for Environmental Experiential Programs here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Each of our talks this summer is worth one Vermont CLE credit, so please keep track of which talks you attend for your records. We'll have some time for Q&A after today's presentation, and for those of you watching on VLGS YouTube, please feel free to enter your questions in the chat space on the right-hand side of the page at any time during the presentation, and we'll get through as many questions and comments as we can. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Stephanie Haynes and Melanie Stetson Freeman. Stephanie is the lead climate change and environment writer for the Christian Science Monitor, where she helps organize environmental coverage across desks and departments. She spent years as a foreign correspondent, has reported across Africa and the Caribbean, and holds teaching positions at Yale University's School of the Environment and College of William & Mary. She's a multiple-time grantee of the Pulitzer Center and is the author of White Man's Game, Saving Animals, Rebuilding Eden, and Other Myths of Conservation in Africa. Stephanie joins us at VLGS this term as one of our Animal Law Media Fellows, selected from a very highly competitive group of candidates. Joining Stephanie on this talk, we're pleased to have Melanie Stetson Freeman, staff photographer with the Christian Science Monitor since 1985. While covering news and feature assignments, Melanie has visited every continent and more than 80 countries. Before joining the Monitor, she worked for the Orange County Register in Santa Ana, California, and interned at the San Jose Mercury News in California, the Florida Times Union in Jacksonville, Florida, and the Simi Valley Enterprise in California. Melanie has a Master of Arts in Journalism from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and a Bachelor of Arts from Principia College in Elsa, Illinois, where she majored in history. Today, they will present animal storytelling. Please join me in welcoming to Hot Topics Stephanie Haynes and Melanie Stetson Freeman.
Well, thanks so much. I'm gonna start. Again, I'm Stephanie, and we work for the Christian Science Monitor. And if you don't know our publication, we are a non-religious news organization that's been around since the beginning of the 20th century. We have international bureaus, we've won a bunch of awards, and we were founded at a time when there was a lot of divisiveness and attack journalism. And our founder created the Monitor to be a place that would injure no man and bless all mankind, in the gendered language of the day. And we have continued that mission, and we still have a unique goal right now where, especially at this time of divisiveness, we are trying to be a news organization that will reach everybody. Regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, we feel like there are these amazing things in the world that we can highlight that will find commonalities and bring people together. And writing about animals is one of these things. And both Mel and I have reported on this subject for years. And we wanted to talk a little bit about that because it's not a straightforward topic. And to start, I want to tell the story of a cow. And actually, it's a story of two cows, or one cow and one steer. And this is the first one. Her name is simply number 2945. And Mel and I met her in the laboratories at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, where she was standing in this methane monitoring chamber. Now, scientists were interested in everything about number 2945. They cared about what she ate and what she drank and the molecular composition of her exhale, everything. They monitored all of her vital statistics, day and night. And they had an important reason for this. Cows produce methane. And this audience here probably knows this, but this is because the cow and other ruminants digest food. The way that they digest food, they belch methane. And methane is a potent greenhouse gas. And greenhouse gases are warming the atmosphere. And so because of this, cows have become the focus of the climate change movement. Researchers estimate that cows are responsible for 30% of the methane produced in the US. And that's in part because there are a lot of cows. The stats that I found when I was reporting this story say that there were 28.2 million beef cattle in the US, along with 9.36 million dairy cows and 33.6 million calves. And those numbers, which are sort of unfathomably big, paled in comparison to countries such as India, which had an estimated 61 million milk cows, or Brazil, with around 234 million beef cattle. So here's what I wrote about number 2945. I wrote, scientists carefully record what this cow eats and what she drinks. They open the chamber only once a day so as to limit disturbances to her environment. Every breath she takes, or more crucially, exhales, is also measured to its molecular level. There's hydrogen, there's carbon recorded down to its isotopic composition. There's oxygen. And most important to the state-of-the-art study, there is methane. And I go on to write about how Cornell professors are using this information to try to come up with new biotechnology that will help lower methane emissions from cattle across the world. And that can take a bunch of different forms. It can be new high-tech food additives. It can be new high-tech methane measuring components and a bunch of other things. And all of that, according to the researchers involved, would be a win for the environment. And so that's the first cow. And I'll come back to her and we'll talk more about her experience. But just given everything I've said there, I'd like you to think for a quick moment the way that number 2945 exists in the story. Like what role does she play? And does it have anything to do with her as a creature? But for now, let's go on to the second cow. This here is Greg, the cow. And the human with him is a guy named Gene Bauer, who has started an organization called the Farm Sanctuary in the Finger Lakes of New York State. And Mel and I, again, were working on the story, and she's the one who took all of the amazing photographs in this presentation. And we actually met Greg and his human shortly after we went to Cornell, to the laboratory. So it was on the same reporting trip that brought us to upstate New York. And what was interesting about Greg is that in most farm settings, he would not be alive. The offspring of cows bred for milk the male offspring are usually killed when they're young. And milk cows themselves are bred to be huge. They produce more milk that way. And so Greg was really, really big, which was quite startling when he pranced over to us looking for anything like he was just an immensely huge dog wanting to play. And Jean here explained that that's what was going on. Greg is just a really friendly guy. And yeah, that prancing motion was a suggestion that he'd like to play. And so, this farm sanctuary is really interesting. We met a lot of other animals on that particular reporting day. We met goats and we met chickens, and Mel liked the goats here for sure. So did I. They're really fun. And we met other animals that we usually group when we're writing about them in this class of domesticated or farmed animals. The purpose of this farm sanctuary is to both give animals respite from mistreatment, like a lot of the animals there are rescued from farm operations, and make sure that they won't ever be harvested for food or other products. But it's also a place that's supposed to educate the public, people like us, journalists, about how these animals are, how they act and what they do, how they connect with each other, how they interact with humans when they're living in a way that's as close to natural as possible, and realizing that natural is a really tricky term and we can go all into that. And clearly this was a very different storyline than the one that I wrote about the other cow, 2945, and the characters there were really different. Here again is a cow from the Cornell story that we wrote in a dairy barn. But before we jump to conclusions, again, there's this question of storytelling. How do we know which storyline is right? And maybe for a moment, just if you're listening to this talk, think for a second what storylines we could write and how your own perspectives might shape those different storylines. So could this first cow in the Cornell laboratories be a story about animal cruelty? Could it be a story about saving the environment? Could it be about animal welfare? The same with the farm sanctuary. Could that be about animal welfare? Could it be about anthropomorphizing and vegan propaganda? It's really hard to know. I mean, this didn't look as fun as what was happening on the farm sanctuary, but I'm not a cow. I don't know. And this one was really interesting. These were technicians at that cow lab. And when I was putting the slideshow together, AI came up with the suggestion that these were two people in blue overalls petting a cow. And so what they're doing is they're moving the cow into a methane measuring chamber. There's food there. She's putting her head in. They're going to do scientific experiments on her. It just goes to show that so much of how we talk about and tell stories about animals are about us. And for other stories we report, of course, the characters would tell us what they think. I would ask these cows, I would ask these other creatures how they're doing. What do they like? What are their perspectives? And, there's certainly a lot of important questions and debates right now about how other humans play into journalistic storylines or narratives. And there's certainly a line of criticism that journalists find people to fit their preconceived storylines, that we might pick and choose what people say to fit our stories. But I would argue that people who do solid journalism do an awful lot of listening. We're curious, and pretty much every story that I do changes from what I originally think it is to what I end up writing because I'm listening. And curiosity has to be the driver. And it gets really tricky then with non-human animals. And what happens a lot of times is that these other beings become vessels for our own stories. What then is our ethical goal in telling these stories? And what are our ethical responsibilities to make sure that these other creatures that we are writing about have some agency? And I'd love, if people are interested in that, I'd love to go back and forth about that in the Q&A, because it's not really an answerable question, but it's one that Mel and I, as people who care very much about these non-human animals experiences, we have it front of mind whenever we're doing our work. And I think a lot of it has to do with big topics like reciprocity. Like, how are we approaching these animals to tell our story? How do we find connection? How do we approach non-human animals with the same dignity and appreciation as we approach our human subjects? And all of this is why photographic storytelling is a huge part of reporting about non-human animals. And I'm so glad that Mel was kind enough to join this conversation because she's just amazing at this. And I'm gonna show some of the stories that she's taken, and she'll explain how she approaches these topics. Um, we like to find stories that show three-dimensionality to our non-human animal subjects, ways that they connect with both humans and with each others. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, the author Robin Wall Kimmerer talks of noticing that her students generally believed that humans were separate from nature, that even those who cared about, the environment believed in a narrative framework where humans were bad to the environment and that humans and the rest of the ecosystem were in opposition, that there was a separateness there, that humans weren't part of nature. And I think that one of the things that Mel and I try to do a lot is that by finding stories where the characters, both human and non-human, model a different type of existence, it opens the door to asking these big questions about how do we storytell and how do we find the stories that get us out of the preconceived narrative frameworks that can sometimes limit the way that we storytell. Um, One of the first stories that Mel and I actually did together was about these tigers in South Africa. And if you're pausing and think there aren't tigers in South Africa, you would be right. Except these were there because they were part of this rewilding program. So there was a conservation effort to bring Chinese tigers to South Africa, where there was a lot of land and a lot of infrastructure focused on rewilding, or getting captive animals used to their environments enough so that they could go back out into nature. And they wanted to try to both rehabilitate and breed these tigers and then rewild them to the point that they could go back to their native habitats. And here, Mel, I'm wondering whether I can tap you to talk a little bit about this. Like when you go, we had this story. What are you looking for when you try to tell about what this story is about? Because these tigers were at the center of it, but again, we can't interview the tigers, so your work ends up being how they speak in some ways. How do you approach a story like this?
Well, as Steph said, I'm a huge animal lover. I try to do animal stories as often as my editors will let me. So anytime I go on a trip, I always look to see if there's a story I can do. And I was lucky enough to meet with Steph in South Africa and do this story about these Chinese tigers. They brought them there because the South Africans are expert at working with wildlife. So I think were there three of them, Steph, three tigers, and they were trying to teach them how to hunt again with a little help. I think they were bringing, Steph, help me here. Were they bringing other critters in there for them to hunt? And
Yeah, it started
yeah,
off with dead animals that they would
yeah,
toss in the truck, and they were trying to like get them. They were used to essentially kibble, and they had like by
right.
the time we got there, they had moved to carcasses, and they were hoping to get to the point where they would actually be able to hunt.
Hunt on their own. Steph and I were riding in the back of a pickup truck as we were going through their habitat, and they had a fire extinguisher to use in case the tigers started going for the tires of the car. And at one point, we stopped and we were on the other side of the fence from their habitat, and Steph was the smallest of our group, and some of them were stalking her on the other side of the fence, moving back and forth. Yeah, like that. Well, not right there, but one of those guys was stalking Stephanie. So I think they were maybe learning how to hunt, but we don't see any pictures of the people that were working with them, but they're my heroes. they were trying to bring up the population of these tigers. And I think there was a very wealthy Chinese woman, another animal lover, who was paying for all of this, as you can imagine, quite expensive.
And so when we do these stories, getting these photos, I mean, you see in this photo, for instance, that the power of these creatures and the fact that they're behind a cage, but they're also in the other areas, you saw the expansiveness of it. So it's like our attempt to bring, I can write what I want to write, but you can't see the beauty and the power of these animals without the photographic component of it. And at the same time, I love Mel's work because it's not just like, to go back here, this could be like really look like in the wild, but she's telling the full story that there is like a human element here involved. Again, this was an example of people working together and trying to do something for a species that was helpful, as opposed to the traditional story that you often see of, a species that is endangered. And certainly, though, that is an important component of the story, but we also realize that in a lot of our pieces, if we just go at the bad things that are happening to this species, isn't that a shame? That's not a great way to engage people's emotions. And like, a lot of people just shut off. It's too sad. They don't want to know the details. They don't think that there's anything that they can do. But by finding those human animal connection points, it really expands people's abilities to see what's possible. And here, and Mel, would you be willing to talk about the cheetahs? Because that's another story.
Yeah, I didn't work on this one with you, but there's a cheetah rehabilitation, breeding and rehabilitation place also in South Africa. This is, what's her name? I had her name here somewhere. Anyway, they were trying to show us how fast the cheetahs can run. But this is run by a woman named Anne Van Dyke. This was a long time ago. And the cheetahs were going through the farmland in South Africa and taking livestock. So the farmers nearby weren't happy about this. So she would tell them, if you have a cheetah problem, please call us, tell us, we'll come and capture the cheetah and, remove it to a different location so it's not killing your wildlife. Because that's a huge problem, is wildlife interacting with livestock. So I think there's another photo of Anne with her big girl. That's Big Girl. And obviously these guys are used to humans. So, but I don't think anybody could touch Big Girl but Anne. I don't remember touching Big Girl. But I love to tell stories about people that are helping wildlife like Anne. And I know her work is continuing now. This was, like I said, probably quite a few years ago, but her work is carrying on.
You also show in a lot of your stories the interaction between animals and other animals. It's sort of, this is another place where I feel like photography can go that written journalism can't do as well, which is to show the relationships between animals with each other. Humans aren't the only characters in your
I think I know what you're leading up to.
And so this is one that was just, I noticed that. And I noticed in these 3 series of the cheetah photos, you have the cheetah in its power natural element, you have the cheetah with a human, and you have the cheetahs with each other.
Yeah.
This was another interspecies.
Yes, this is one of my favorite stories. This is at the elephant sanctuary in Tennessee. This is Tara the elephant with Bella, the stray dog, that they're best friends and they follow each other everywhere. The dog was on the just was living on the site of the sanctuary, and these two bonded. And when one is sick, the other waits there for them until they're better. And the next photo is one of my favorite photos of all times. They love each other. I mean, clearly there was this great connection. Sadly, Bella has passed, but now Tara has bonded with some of the other elephants, so she's not alone.
focusing on this sort of relationship and finding these points of love and connection is something that the monitor tries to do a lot. We try to take, there are a lot of really hard and sad things in the world, and we don't avoid those. But we tend to believe that in all of these difficult struggles in these difficult situations, whether it's political or, um, or environmental, there are these places of love, places of connection, places of hope that if we can highlight them, not in a Pollyannish way, but in a way that opens the aperture on an issue, those are the stories that we tend to motivate people and make people want to help and engage. And so it's a story about an elephant sanctuary, and we could talk a lot about the problems facing elephants or the harm caused to elephants in the US from the circus industry. We could go globally. I'm just working with some reporters right now in an editor capacity to write stories about elephants endangered because of conflict zones in Northern Africa. Like there are a lot of things that are hard, but again, going back to like, what is the point of what we're doing? What is the point of our journalism when it comes to non-human animals? And I guess for us, it's opening hearts, opening the aperture for how things can help, and sort of expanding the view of what can be is really important for us, even when we don't shy away from what's wrong. So I thought that story was those pictures resonate with people. Here is another approach to that. And Mel, would you be willing to tell about this story?
Sure. One of my favorite stories of all time was visiting Doc Rogers. Dr. Lynn Rogers is the black bear expert. He's in his 80s. He's been trying to teach people about black bears his whole career. This is up on the border of Canada and Minnesota, where there are lots and lots of wild black bears. This is a wild black bear. They'd named them so that they can keep track of them. So this guy's named Cedric. And people in this community, it's a very wooded area with, quite a bit of land between the homes. People put out hazelnuts and M&Ms and all kinds of things for these black bears to eat. This was a summer where they had a lot of drought, so there wasn't a lot of berries and things that the bears normally would eat in the woods. So I happened upon, coming there at a great time to see a lot of bears. This is Elvis. He's a yearling. Looks like a little kid. I love this photo. And he's eating peanuts at the picnic table at Doc Rogers Research Center. He has classes every summer that get sold out every year of people wanting to come and learn from him and see these bears. And mind you, they're all wild bears. These are not trained. They're not captive. They're out wandering wherever they want to go. I think there's a shot of Doc Rogers with, oh yeah,
Go to that
one of the women. Oh, there's Cedric right before he met me. This is Doc Rogers. I think this is the first time he met Elvis, the yearling. It happened right after I arrived at his research center. So I trusted him so much that I knew I could be there feeding a black bear.
I love this picture, Mel, because when I first saw this, it reminded me of the sort of shot if somebody had gotten like a photo package for their kids, right? And then they're going to do all the portrait shots, right?
Yeah.
Like there was the close up. And you do that same treatment when it comes to non-human animals too. Like you're treating their portrait sessions in the same way. And what caused you to take this picture?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm always looking for details, but the beauty of that guy's foot with those huge long nails. And it was one of the women in Doc Rogers' program put her foot beside this bear, and she goes, "Look, barefoot." Get it? But I just love the contrast between the two, but yet they're standing side by side. And I mean, this was miraculous to me. and I'm not, you shouldn't go walking up to a black bear. I'm not saying that. This guy knew what he was doing. He could read their body language, and these bears were used to being around people, but I don't advise it just out of a bear that you meet somewhere in the United States that isn't used to this kind of thing.
With this story, when you guys were doing the reporting, did you tell what was the pushback to this
You can imagine the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, I think, is the group that were not so happy with him. They don't want humans to be interacting with wild animals. But he's just trying to teach people that they're not the angry, growling, human-eating creatures that they've been made out to be, not this species of black bear. He's had pushback on collars that he's tried to put on bears in order to follow them. But he did tell us that something in our story let him know what he needed to do in order to keep working on his project. So we were glad that that could happen.
And that's one of the things that we find with almost all of these stories that we do is that there are these controversies, right? Like people have different ideas of the best way to interact with animals, with non-human animals. So, you can have good-hearted people on both sides saying, no, don't connect to a wild bear. That could lead to this harm. Or yes, do connect to them in this way. And again, it's sort of like, I know I keep coming back to this, but this idea of can you approach the whole story with a lot of dignity, including a lot of like an a special amount of dignity to the creatures involved, and you can then write about that debate. But then it sort of creates the conversation as opposed to creating a right and a wrong or a good guy and a bad guy. And I mean, to go back to some of the farmed animal conversations, this is really important for us. When we went to the farm sanctuary, I ended up writing a story that was looking at the research that that organization was doing on its animals. And they were trying to do behavioral and cognizance research in a different type of way, where animals like chickens would essentially give consent before participating in research studies, the same ways that humans would give consent before getting involved with different types of medical surveys. And what they were finding connected to a lot of work that was being done outside of that particular area about essentially the inner lives of animals and this big question about whether and which animals had consciousness and what consciousness means when it's related to a non-human animal like a bear or a goat or even an octopus or a fruit fly. And Mel, I remember you went and you also shot a woman who was looking at bees and exploring the ways that bees consciousness works, and then how does that bring up different ethical considerations. And it was a powerful piece for us because it didn't start from the point of view that, look, it's cruel to farm animals. If you eat meat, you're bad. It started from this other way that embraced a lot of work and a lot of humanity and gave dignity to as many characters as we could. And it resonated really well. And we had some editors, or I had some editors at the beginning of the story who was worried about it falling into that trope that I first mentioned. They're like, we don't want to do a story that's going to make all non-vegans feel badly about themselves and then just be able to characterize that piece as a meat is bad article. And again, it takes a lot of depthful reporting to make sure that we're getting at the different research, the different sides, and really trying to create as three-dimensional portraits as we possibly can. This is just one more character, Mel, and I didn't put in a bunch of these slides, but I was hoping you might be willing to share a little bit about this.
Taken at Chimp Haven, which is in Louisiana, and they have rescued lots of chimps from laboratories. And this chimp is named Sarah. So she's having a watermelon treat. There were a lot of chimps there, some very elderly. Chimps are very territorial, and they have certain groups that do work together and some that don't. So they would have to, I don't know how they did this, but they would figure out which chimps they could put in groups, which ones maybe some needed to be by themselves. And they would get treats every so often in the day. There was one I remember, one of the oldest ones, maybe her name was Mama, Big Mama or something, but she was in a cage right near the building where the people would come to work. And every time they came in, she'd start screaming and yelling, "Yay!" You know, it sounded like, "Yay, you're here." She'd just start hooting and hollering. And it was the most wonderful welcome for anybody coming to work. So I just love to show the character of these creatures. They are so like us in so many ways. And I love when people, you know, especially get them out of horrible situations. I can't believe they were in labs, but they're happy now at least.
So that's a bit of a start about how we approach these stories and tell them. And I wanted to leave enough time for questions and conversations because I can talk in a lot of different ways. I mean, there are a lot of different issues that we come up with for doing these. One is that we have to find the stories. We have to pitch the stories in a way that our editors will approve them. And then we have to make sure that we're writing them in a way that we don't lose readers. And again, and we also have to keep this ethical consideration of how do we even decide the stories that are most important to tell. Again, I think it's a super combined effort between writing and reporting and the photography. It all works really importantly together. And again, you know, I'd love to hear any questions that the audience has here.
That's terrific. And what a wonderful portfolio of stories and pictures that you all shared with us during this talk. We do have a few questions that have come in the chat. And as I mentioned at the outset, please, if you are interested in participating in the discussion and you're watching live on VLGS YouTube, please enter your questions in the chat box that's on the right-hand side of the page. Great engagement so far. We've got a question from Professor Delcy Winders, who's the head of our Animal Law and Policy Institute here at VLGS. Her question starts, "Thank you for the great presentation. Storytelling is such a critical piece of legal advocacy, and photos are increasingly incorporated into litigation, especially animal cases. And I myself have noticed a trend to greater use of graphics and narrative in legal complaints and civil complaints that are filed in court. Do you have thoughts on how we might incorporate more of these storytelling skills into law and policy training?"
Do you want to start with the photographic aspect of that, Mel? Or
Well, I mean, the question kind of already said this, but I think when you can show what you're talking about, especially with an animal that's looking you in the eye, that's going to be very moving. And I know that doesn't help with law itself, but you can't help but play on the emotion of people when you do that. So I'm all for it.
And what are the risks associated with that? I think that historically lawyers have been very cautious, I think, about in documents that are filed and shared. I think a little reticence to show photographic evidence in that sense. It always has played a huge role in trials, cases that go before a jury or before a judge. But oftentimes in the world of environmental and administrative law that many of our students and faculty participate in doesn't quite get to that point. Oftentimes many cases settle before trial, so you don't have the full presentation of the evidence. You don't have the authentication of the photograph that it was taken there by this person, and the like to sort of prove it. But we're seeing this increasingly, and it may have some parallels to the way you think about how to present photographs as part of this storytelling enterprise. Are there any risks or concerns that you try to navigate that might be, transferable to how lawyers and advocates should think about the use of the photographs and videos and other types of evidence like that?
I think in these days you have to be so careful about making sure it's a original image. It's not been doctored in any way. There's so much fake news out there, and now it's so easy with AI to change images or videos or make completely fake ones. I'm not sure how you prove that your image is not faked, but that's a huge issue. We don't alter our images in any way, except for, lightening and darkening certain areas. We don't remove things or put things in or, anything like that. So that's super important. I don't know, Steph, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would jump in. I mean, I think there are a couple of aspects to that. I mean, and to piggyback on what Mel is saying here, I think step one is to make sure that the lawyers themselves are 100% sure that the image is not doctored, because it's real tricky. And like I could see, I'm not a lawyer. I'm really excited for next week when I will learn more about this from you guys. But it would seem like a great way to undermine a case would be to use an image that you then find is fake, right? Like, so just the same. And as far as the storytelling parallels, I mean, one of the things that ethically, one of the ways, as you would like present the facts of a case or of an argument, you can also present the facts of the science behind what we know about animals' cognizance right now. So there's a lot of research that has been done that is moving the way that scientists writ large are understanding animals' emotional experiences, that could be employed to lay out in the same way that can help support images. So if you see an image of, say, a dog looking sad, you can also back that up with research that explains that what that image seems to be is actually what it is, or that it isn't, right? But I think that really knowing and understanding what these images show for real is going to be super important, because as where we started this, the animals can't tell us, we can't quote them, and so it's really easy to use them. And so ethically, I would imagine that that would have to be a really strong standard in law as well as with journalism, to make sure that it's not exploitative or extractive.
Those are really important considerations. I think there's a lot parallels with our respective ethical obligations, and yeah, the risks that something presented might be misinterpreted without the appropriate context provided through the written word or through the presentation of the photograph or the video in a way that is faithful to the truth. I think that's certainly a shared obligation that we all have, even in the context of advocacy. I'll move on to the next question, which is that a growing body of evidence indicates that images showing humans in direct contact with animals, including captive animals, can harm conservation efforts. There's also some indication that it can further the exotic pet trade and harmful petting industries by making viewers want to have the kinds of experiences they see on the screen or in the photograph. Is this something to take into consideration in deciding what types of photos and stories that you pursue?
I have thoughts, but do you want to go first, or do you?
Go ahead.
I mean, I think one of the big things for us is that as journalists, like our mission is to show what's there. And so if there is a human, it's also to do no harm. We don't want to harm any human or any animal. But if there is an emotional connection between a human and an animal, if we are illuminating a helper, that's something that we probably we haven't studied this, but we know from the letters and from the responses that we do have to our stories that the motivation that that gives also goes in a really pro-social way. And we're also trying to do depthful stories. So when we're showing, for instance, I'll go back to the farm sanctuary, the cow, like the worker at the farm sanctuary who was given the cow a hug, right? When you see the photo in context with the story, there's an awful lot of information there that puts that photo into context, the same way that there are important photos that put the words into context. And so it is a package for us. And I think, I mean, I'm glad to have you bring that up, but it's not, I don't think that that would change our approach to it, because there's probably a story that shows that anything that we publish or write could have somebody could do something silly with it. I don't know. Mel, do you want to go on with
Well, it
that?
is a really good point, and
Yeah.
all I can say is that Doc Rogers, we're talking about the bears here, he's an expert. He's been studying these creatures for decades and decades. He's actually gone into their hibernation areas with the bears and been with the cubs and the mothers and never been injured. So yeah, I am recording what this man does. It's his life work. It's what he's trying to teach us. Not that we should go feed bears, but that they're not horrible creatures that should be shot if they go in your garbage can, or that sort of thing. So I'm
See,
okay with it.
you bring up this, I mean, it's an awesome question, because like this is something that I see all the time in the reporting that I do, is this debate about like how close should humans and animals be? Like how, like, do we cross a line where there's anthropomorphizing? Do we cross a line where there's sort of a lack of care? Where, like, what should that relationship be? And I think it's a great point to make sure that we're considering the potential harm and the pros and cons of all of it. But I think it's a debate that maybe doesn't have a clear answer. And so it's one that I think is super interesting to get into. And I think actually has a lot of similar resonance in different things, not just in the photographs of humans and non-human animals.
I'll move on to the next question. I think we might return to that theme before we close. But comment and question from Melissa. Thank you for joining us, Melissa, from South Dakota. Thank you for both this discussion and sharing your work and passion. In your reporting on animals' inner lives and emotional complexity, how do you navigate the ethical and legal implications that follow from portraying animals as having sentience, being sentient beings? How do you navigate that question?
It's the big one, right? Like that is the big question. Okay, if we recognize that these other animals around us have this same capability, man, that has a lot of implications for pretty much everything in the human world. I mean, a lot of times people talk about food systems, but it goes way beyond that, right? It's about, how do we build? Is it, when is it ethical to put a road in or a house? Or how do we, like, should energy systems? There's so much that expands from it. And again, as journalists, our job isn't necessarily to answer those questions. But what I tried to do when I've written about this is really push people to give me what their answers are. And, I have and to really try to ask those follow-up questions. So, okay, if you believe this, what then is your ethical responsibility? And if you believe that you need to reduce harm, what does that mean? And for that one story that I mentioned, I talked to probably a dozen different philosophers about this, and they all had slightly different answers to it, from sort of this focus on reciprocity and this idea of how do we reduce the harm that we do in the world? How do we manage to rethink everything from swatting a fruit fly to, I don't know, mowing down a meadow. And what I tried to do with that is to try to get as many of those answers in the piece as possible and to raise the question. It's something that I'd love to keep reporting on because I think there are a lot of different answers. And it's also something that I keep a lens on when I report other stories. So trying to bring that question to some of the other topics that I report, so that if I'm writing about a solar farm somewhere, it also, there are other creatures besides just the humans that might be involved.
Well, that sort of feeds in a little bit to the next question from Melissa, which is, do you believe journalism can or should influence sort of these legal frameworks around animal personhood or rights that kind of flow from this question of, at least in part, flow from this sort of ethical quandary around sentience?
I mean, I think that journalism is, I'm sure, again, you in the legal community have a much better sense of this than I do, but my sense is that there's always this push and pull between cultural and societal understandings and legal decision making. And so the more the journalism is able to illuminate what we know about animal sentience, the easier it becomes, I suspect, in legal cases to make arguments around legal sentience. And then the other way around too. Like, we need to cover what's happening legally and also cover what's happening scientifically and socially and culturally, which then can affect the legal decision making. So I say, so I guess the short answer is, yeah, I think journalism has a really important role in this, because it again, I think ideally what journalism does is it opens people's apertures that things exist. And the more that happens, the more the legal processes that are also inherently operating in that cultural societal framework can evolve. Should there be a specific goal for journalism to allow for different legal arguments to succeed? That's probably not our role. We just have to, again, our role is to report on as much as we can what is and the questions that are around those things.
Here's a question talking about you're referencing anthropomorphism. Increasingly, there's also a critique of anthropodenialism, where there's denial that humans have human-like cognitive and emotional experience. Do you think that as that becomes that's certainly part of the cultural conversation in some corners, that we're sort of gone too far in this direction, and in fact there's such a divide, and the question is sort of, do you think your work, which really shows very powerfully that different perspective, can help overcome that denialism that we see, where there is almost a advocacy for alienation, as we, certainly we've definitely seen that, of course, in the farmed animal context, over time, and recently as we've seen different legal efforts in that area. So just wondering if you have a thought on that, discussion that's happening.
I can keep talking, but Mel, do you have
Keep
anything?
talking. No, go.
Um, I will say, and actually, I mean, this is something where when Mel and I were reporting in I was a correspondent in Southern Africa in the mid 2000s. And at that point, oh my gosh, like against anthropomorphism was like the biggest thing in the conservation world. Like, don't go too far to anthropomorphize the animals. You're gonna no, we're not gonna do that because that's anthropomorphizing them. We're gonna like it's been a decided shift scientifically and culturally. And so I think that our role, a lot of what we try to do, and this is again sort of a unique monitor approach, is we are really interested in shifts in thought. Like that is one of the main things that we want to write about. You know, sometimes when people talk about news, it's very superficial. It's a very superficial level, and it actually can be confusing to news consumers because you're really not going deeply into what's actually shifting or what is actually changing. And so one of our goals at the Christian Science Monitor is to really understand how these thoughts are changing. And so again, it's not our place to forward one thought versus the other or one approach versus the other, but it is our job to really focus on this idea that, wow, we really got into this like Descartian animals are different. Let's not confuse them with humans. And now there is this big swing back, at least in the scientific world and some in the conservation world, against that. Like our job is to document who is shifting and why and how. And so I think that these trends that you're talking about are exactly the sort of things that we do want to be writing about and have a responsibility to write about.
So maybe we've got time for one more question, I think, and I'll take the moderator's privilege and ask my question, which is something that I like to talk about with all the wonderful journalists we invite to participate in our summer programs and lectures. Sort of how do you see the role of this, journalism at this moment where the type of in-depth and detailed reporting that you both have done, which obviously requires time and expense, and is increasingly threatened economically, for sure. And how are you looking at your work as the environment has changed for journalism, and society's investment in it, of this highly ethical, well-sourced, taking the time, for example, with Mel's comment about the bear expert, to really have done the research and gone deep on whether that source is a reliable source that you want to showcase, and how that's become more of a challenge. So is there a sense that you both have about where things are going in your worlds?
Well, like you said, it's not good. So many journalists are losing their jobs. There aren't that many sources of professional information anymore. Lots of people with opinions, people seem to want to listen to what they already believe. So just makes us more committed to unbiased journalism, really serious topics. What are the problems? What are the solutions? But you're right, it costs a lot of money, and every outlet is fighting for subscribers, and especially us, because we have a funny name. But I think our work is more important than ever with the division in our country.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Mel said, and that's a little plug. a lot of the ways that people are trying, a lot of news organizations are trying to solve a really tricky economic problem, which is that people don't want to pay for news, right? And so, number one, pay for news. If you're not paying for news and you're getting news, you're actually the product, not the consumer. And that's something that is a message that I definitely try to get out. But at the Monitor, we've also made a specific decision that we're not going to try to win this game by either trying to hack your attention or play into your pre-existing biases. Many news organizations who do great reporting have decided that that's what the business model has to be. We're decidedly not doing that. We're trying to do something that's really in some ways countercultural, but that we think is really good for the world and for our readers, which is that we're trying to stay calm. We're trying to find these deeper values to write about. We're trying to inform without alarming, and we're trying not to divide people, yet while still informing them of what is going on in the world. It's not easy. It's a really hard line. We have a lot of internal conversations about it, but we're trying really hard to do that. And so, definitely try to read us if you want. But even if it's not us, whatever you find your valuable news source to be, it is so important that we get consumers purchasing that product if they find it valuable, because the other economic forces are really destructive.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. I fully support that message and encourage all my students to do as much high quality professional reading as possible, and build that into your both personal and professional budget and lives. So thank you for making this contribution to the Hot Topics lecture series. We're out of time for today, but thanks again, Steph and Mel, for your presentation, which visually one of my favorites of the summer, for sure, and some really, really thoughtful observations from your long years of work on this topic. And so thanks everyone for joining us today. Our final week of our summer lecture series will take place next week. Have a absolutely wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you so much.